My understanding is that if you guys are going on the calls, that DPS is responding. So I would hope that that happens every time, because you never know in these cases too, especially, and there could be a safety issue. If it's a relationship violence incident, there might be some safety issues happening. So I certainly wouldn't want you to be trying to figure all of that out. So if you're feeling like there might be a safety issue, I think it makes sense to call DPS. But if it's just, oh, I was sexually assaulted a few days ago, I don't know if I should go to the hospital, you could call us and we could talk about it. So, any other questions?
As a male, would I, if I was assigned to be the crew chief on the crew, would it be okay for me to approach a victim, or should I relinquish that role to a female?
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to handle that kind of situation. Does anybody have any other specific procedure questions? Okay, great. So that kind of is where I was going to start with talking about how to respond to victims when you're on the scene. So I think it's always appropriate to ask the victim, to just approach them and say, are you comfortable with this? Do you want to have a female over here? That's fine. They might say, no, it's okay, it's fine. But give them that choice, give them that control. One of the things that is really important in these situations is that the victim feels that they have as much choice as possible. There are going to be some things that they might not have much choice on, like as far as going to the hospital, that kind of thing. But we want to give them as much control as possible. So asking them, if you know ahead of time that it is a sexual assault call, it might be best, and there's a female available, it might be best to just have a female respond to it anyway. You just want to make sure that if you're offering to have a female respond, that there is actually a female who can back that up. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, is a lot of victims will have a preference of having a female treat them, having a female work with them. Another thing to remember too is that oftentimes, because of whatever traumatic experience they might have had, the victims might seem disoriented. I'm sure you guys experience that a lot for a variety of different reasons. But just as a reminder, it can also happen with trauma too. So people can become very disoriented, both to time and place, and also just to what's been happening. So they might not be able to really tell you exactly what happened from beginning to end. They might just get bits and pieces. They might, they might feel badly because they're not able to give you all the information. So just keeping that in mind, that trauma can have that effect too. They also might have a number of concerns that they might be asking you about. So specific to sexual assault, they might be concerned about having contracted an STD. They might be concerned about having contracted HIV. So those might be questions that they might be asking. So you would want to give them information on that. We can, in working with victims through the university, we can have some of that testing done at health services if it's not something they want to go to the hospital for. So that's something you could know too. And also know too that we can also, make arrangements if somebody has difficulty with insurance companies or things like that. We can also help them out. We certainly don't want the cost of medical services to be a barrier for somebody to receive the services that they need. So you could always just suggest that they give us a call, that they work with one of us, because we can handle all those issues. Okay, but those are some things to think about, that those might be specific questions that they would have. And as far as approaching them, just kind of remembering your body language, remembering that you're in their space and they've just had that personal space violated. So that could be very triggering for them. So just remembering to ask, is it okay if I touch you? Is it okay if I do this? Maybe being mindful of explaining exactly what it is that you're doing, exactly what kind of procedure you're using, or what it is that you're checking for, what it is that you're looking for, because that can be helpful in just helping them feel in control. Even though those are things that you're going to do because you want to assess the situation, just letting them know what's going on can oftentimes really help them feel a little more grounded and feel comfortable. So just being mindful of that. And being mindful if you do have to get close for some reason, just saying, I'm going to get a little bit closer to you, is that okay? Asking them and just, trying to work around those things. I mean, if they say no, then just, try to explain why it is that you need to get close and see if you can work around that. because they might say, no, that's not okay, I don't want you near me. And then maybe talk about, okay, well, maybe you do need a female over here. Would that be okay? Also, kind of in thinking about the language that you're using, I'm not sure exactly, luckily not having to have interacted with too many ambulance people, I'm not sure exactly what kind of questions you might be asking of the victim, but if you have to ask questions, try to do it in a non-blaming sort of way. Oftentimes, we'll ask questions like, well, what were you doing outside here? And to a victim who's just been through a traumatic experience, they might feel blamed in that way. So trying to say things like, okay, so you were outside and tell me what happened next, rather than what were you doing. So kind of trying to ask questions in a more neutral way. And a lot of that can just be taken care of by changing the tone that you use or just changing your body language that goes along with it. Provide encouragement for them. So, providing encouragement, saying supportive things like, it's okay, you're doing the right thing here. There are places where you can get support. Saying encouraging things like that can also be really helpful for them. And, if they do come out with any self-blaming statements, saying things like, oh, this was really stupid, or I don't know why I called you, or, it wasn't a big deal, or maybe I shouldn't have been out, or they say anything that's self-blaming or minimizing, try to address it as much as you can. Just say, no, you're doing the right thing, and, that's why we're here, and we're here to assess the situation, and, we'll figure out how to help you. So trying to really provide any kind of support in the moment that you can. Also just be mindful of their relationships and their concerns about those. So oftentimes, especially if it's a situation where the ambulance comes, they're going to be really mindful of like, what are people in my dorm going to think? What are other people around me going to think? So they might really be worried about people finding out. They might be worried about the parents finding out. So those might all be concerns that they have. So just try to, again, kind of going back to reassuring them, no, you're doing the right thing and you can figure all that out later, or, referring them back to our team for support with those things, because those are all things that we can help with too. If it becomes a problem that everybody finds out in the dorm and they're feeling isolated because of that, we can help with that. We can also provide emotional support. We can help them talk to their parents about what happened if they want to. So those are all things that we can help with. So referring them back to us after listening is really good. Yeah, so that's all that I have.
I just want to remind everyone too that both males and females can be victims. It's not always, you hear the blame of sexual assault, don't just assume that it's a female. It could be a male, it could be a male was assaulted by a male was assaulted by a female. It could be any sort of scenario. I think a lot of times we get like stuck in thinking that it's one-sided and it's not. So feel reminded about that.
I would even take that a step further and say it could be anyone of any gender that could be assaulted. Thank you for bringing that up. A lot of my language was directed towards female victims because oftentimes that's where we see the concerns, in who's responding. But anybody of any gender could be a victim. And so always making sure that they're comfortable with what you're doing and they're comfortable with you responding is really important. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
Do you have a phone number that we can all use in our phones now in case the situation were ever to arise?
Yeah, would that be would we have to go through protocol, or would we, this is why Mitch is here?
That's a good question.
Or would that be, because there might be times where we don't necessarily want them to go through, DPS is involved.
All right, so the main counseling center number, so the number on the page is actually sufficient. So what? After 5, during weekdays and on weekends, if you call the counseling center, you'll get voicemail. It gives you a chance to press to you or get connected with the on-call therapist. There's always oftentimes 2 of us who are actually here physical in the counseling center, people who are on call. But we have an on-call group that's specialized, like at doing telephone assessment and crisis kind of safety planning, that sort of thing. So initially they're going to respond. if anyone is calling, staff member, particular person, and it's related to a sexual or relationship violence call, they should always stop that call and actually let you know that they're gonna call one of us and we'll give you a call back. So if you call that number, so the 315-443-4715, after hours, so after 5 during the week, or again, on the weekend, and the first person who picks up, that person is not one of us in the building and is not the person who should be managing that situation.
Right. So so like Mitch said, what happens is then if it's any kind of issue, whether it's a student calling or a staff member calling, if it's any kind of issue related to sexual or relationship violence, they're supposed to stop the call and say, I need to get your information, contact you. Usually we're going to call you back within like 2 or 3 minutes. I mean, really, as long as it takes for them to contact us, wake us up, and then we'll call you right back. DPS does have information on contacting us as well. So if DPS is already involved, I would suggest that you work with them on contacting us. That would be my thought. But if DPS is not involved, then it's okay to utilize the number that's on the pens. Yeah.
So you said earlier something about 96 hours, like from the time of the assault. So if it's within that time, are we pretty much going to the hospital? Are we sure we're going to the hospital?
Mm-hmm.
Is that something we can tell them, like, or ask them if it's within 96 hours, and that would give us a reason to go to the hospital?
Yeah. I mean, if it's within 96 hours, which is like 4 days, right? I always have to do the calculation every time. But that's quite a bit of time. So generally, we want them to go to the hospital because we want to have them connect with a special nurse so that they can do a forensic exam, they can do a health exam, they can take care of all those issues. So if you're out on a call, I mean, if we're calling from the counseling center and having you dispatched, you're already going to the hospital, basically. We're gonna say, take them to this hospital, we're either meeting you someplace so you can give us a ride, or we're gonna meet you right there. If it's a different kind of call than that, it comes out as you're on the call that this has been a sexual assault and it's occurred within 96 hours, I would recommend that you certainly get a hold of one of us, either through DPS or through that main number, or, you can always say to the victim, the standards are that within 96 hours, you can go to the hospital and have an exam done. It's still their choice, if there's no pressing medical issue, it's still their choice whether or not they want to have that done. So they might decide not to go to the hospital. They might say to you, no, you know what, I just want to make sure I'm okay. So if you're not taking me to the hospital for any other reason, I don't want to go. And that's their choice. You could always let them know too that at the hospital when they do those exams, they will give them their own choices, and they don't have to do the whole exam. So they'll have a lot of choice and they'll have a lot of control over that process. But that's another reason why it'd be really good to get them connected with us, because we can go through all that stuff with them. So, and it is still their choice whether or not they want to connect with us too. Generally we like to be able to at least have a little bit of a phone conversation with the person, just so that they know that we're here. Sometimes it's easier if we can just at least talk to them and say, hi, this is Megan from the SRVR team. Here's what we can offer you. Is there anything I can do for you right now? Rather than just, DPS just says, do you want me to call them? And a lot of times they're like, no, I don't want anybody else involved right now. But we find that it's a little bit easier if we just at least talk to them. So, but they don't have to talk to us either. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I've heard a lot of times that people obviously they want their privacy and inconsistency. So in an instance where they have been in the hospital, on our ambulances, we sometimes have up to 4 people on the ambulance with us. This is a question for you and for maybe Ariel. Would we, if they wanted their privacy, would we maybe have just stick one person in the back with them, and how would we get another crew member home if that's a possibility?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I have the answer. I think that's really good to be thoughtful of, that it might feel very crowded to them if they have a lot of people in the back and it's not totally necessary.
Sometimes we can't always take one off the crew, but if we can stick, one more person in the front, it's definitely not a bad idea. I found that the crowding training to them comes from the police. And a lot of times, you get past Ostrom, and it's not just DPS that's coming, it's SPD, and there are a lot of people that come. So I think even just separating them for a couple of moments from the police to use to make them feel comfortable to talk to you, sometimes that's enough. Like if the crew's clear and the suit's there, and you can send like 2 people in S4 to meet up, it's definitely an option. It's just like a kind of feel the situation out, and if you guys feel that it's better just to have one person in the back of them, then that's fine. If it's better to have a few people and have a normal conversation, more like they're distracting them, whatever you guys think is best. How many people in this room have been on a call for it's not that many people. Yeah, right.
I was going to ask, we were talking, this just made me think of like NOAA training, like that's not a training exercise, like a training experience. With these, would we treat that very similarly? Like this is not a training time. Like I understand that like everyone needs experience in these kind of calls, but like if there's, if the suit's the first there, then like let the suit handle the call. Or if you're the first there and you're like the highest cleared person, or you're a cleared crew chief, like is that something that we just let the cleared person take care of? So we're not going to bring a trainer and like 2 progressions in at once.
The calls I've been on typically run that way, and even if like Real Metro's there first, I just hang around and get the information I need until after, because they, like, whoever's there first, they're usually going to build a relationship with. It's the first person they see, they're going to be there asking the questions initially, so I kind of just let that happen. With my experience, it's usually been Real Metro, but I've had a lot of off-campus.
See, all the sexual assault calls that I have had, it has been me and whoever I'm training, or if I'm the FTO, it has been me and the CCP, just so that I think that this is more of a time to learn by watching than learn by asking, only because when we're learning, we don't want to make this, our number one is always patient comfort, patient confidentiality, patient care. And so I would rather have someone learn what questions to ask before than do a trial by fire and ask something wrong and we've completely lost trust and we've completely lost any rapport that we have with this person. Not that I'm saying that they're not necessarily capable, but.
And at least for me, when I was a CCP, my calls were changing when I wasn't confident in the situation, and that happened when I was on a call that wasn't a normal call for us. So I think that the person that's mainly interacting with the victim needs to be, they have to hold it together for the call and for the victim. So they need to be confident and be able to kind of get through without having those hiccups.
Another very device situation, like Dee and I did a call, and she handled all the patient care. I just kind of sat in the front seat of the ambulance the whole time.
I don't remember who was on the call with Caroline and I. I think once it was AJ. But AJ was nowhere near the patient at any point at any time because it was still very traumatic for her. It had just happened and she absolutely did not want any kind of help. And that's not always the case, but that was the case that time. So AJ kind of took a fight in not being able to train this call, but it was what was necessary.
For a sexual assault call, or any type of call that pertains to this, is this the type of call that a supervisor is automatically going to be going to?
And if it comes in as something else and you get there and figure out that it's this, you notify suit right away. And these PCRs also have to be like pristine. This is a prime example of when something could go to court. And if you're writing a PCR, you want to make sure that everything is there. Do you have any questions? Okay. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Mitch.
I guess before I get started into what I think might be helpful, I wonder if there are particular questions you have, like either about what to assess, what kind of things come up. I can just sort of start off anywhere, but if you have particular places you want me to go, I'll make sure I get there first. Anyone here, or how many people here have been on cases where, yeah.
How do you go about the language barrier?
Language barrier in the sense of...
For suicide ideations.
Okay. In the sense of like
Not,
So-
not English speaking?
Oh,
Right, yeah.
it's complicated. I mean, what I'd say is that honestly, it generally, the only time the language barrier is going to come up here is if what, I'll talk my own experience, think how my translate, is that for all the students who are here, enrolled in schools are not the folks who are in ESL courses. The language is generally sufficient. There's generally not going to be difficulty for the most part. It's incredibly rare. I mean, I ask every student I see who comes in gets asked about suicide, and the number of times I've run into a language barrier has been well less than 1%. But generally, if I run into a language barrier, it's because there may be some language stuff, but I'm not confident and I'm asking things in a way that I'm not being as clear. And so the more direct and specific I can be, the less problem it is.
Right, so for example, this past week I ran into a situation where we were called to the scene for a psychiatric evaluation. DPS was there already, and they got into it with this international student, and he didn't really understand what they wanted to do, and they didn't understand what he was really saying to them. And they ended up handcuffing him and really, in a sense, beating him up. So it was kind of a very difficult situation for us to be put into like act as mediators when I really couldn't understand this kid to start with.
Yeah. And what I say, and I don't know this particular situation, like I'm not privy to it, but what I'd say is the times when I've really run into a language barrier and it's not been, so it's been a full-time student, international or not, and there's really been a language barrier, generally it's been because the person isn't functioning well cognitively. Like the person may be moving towards full-on psychosis. And so it's one of those things, oftentimes that person's getting very agitated and sort of their responses are not really, oftentimes really about what your question is. And so sometimes you ask a question the person may not understand, they'll spit out something that seems related but isn't. And you keep going around in circles, you keep asking the same question and they're not really replying. I'd say more often than not, it's not truly about language, but it's about the person's cognitive process in that time. What are they under the influence of substances, and is there something that's limiting their cognitive abilities? Like each year, probably, I'd say probably 20, probably on the higher side of that, people that we see who are having their first episode of some sort of psychotic break, whether it be mania, whether it be substance-induced or early onset schizophrenia, that those things happen, and sometimes, particularly when DPS gets involved and the person there's other substances, it can become one of those things where they have to use handcuffs or something. And it looks like, what the hell's going on? But sometimes there's not an easy way to resolve it.
Okay.
Again, that may not be the case for that one, but in the instances where I've had language barriers, it really has been more about their cognitive process and not really about real language.
Like,
Good job.
Yeah.
I had some previous experience in crisis management in terms of phone lines, but something that I was always concerned about, saying I'm still concerned about, is saying the wrong thing. So I was wondering if you could educate us about how to avoid saying the wrong thing, things that we should be saying, and how we should be saying, how we should.
And that actually gets what I think is the most important piece of sort of what we do. So we kind of go back. So my role at the counseling center is I'm an assistant director. I've been there for over 10 years. One of the things that I do, along with a couple of other staff members, our director and one of our associate directors, is I go around to other universities and provide training to their staff, including counseling center staff, on how to do what we call gatekeeper training. So essentially it's teaching them how to go out and educate, whether it's faculty or staff, resident advisors, those sorts of folks, on how to recognize when somebody is struggling with a mental health concern, what are the warning signs, what are the things you look for, and how do you interact with that person, both just like general relationship skills, and what are the questions you ask to try to assess whether the person might indeed be thinking about suicide. What I would say first and foremost is the most important thing is that when you start doing this, and again, it probably comes along with anything you're doing when you're assessing somebody, whether it's medical or not, is that you're actually fully engaged. So if for some reason you're asking somebody something and you're like, well, my shift's almost over, so how you doing? And you're in some ways not necessarily glancing at your watch. If you're not engaged, you can ask exactly the right questions and it doesn't matter. Nonverbals are incredibly important. So the idea is if you're there, if you care what's going on, if this is something you like doing and you really are focused on patient care, you can say some of the wrong things and it not really be a big deal. So you don't have to get exactly the right language. I said I'm going to tell you what some of the right language is, but if you're doing the other things right, it's less important. Does that make sense? So I don't want you to be afraid, like, I have to get it exactly right, and if I say the wrong word, this is somehow going to blow up. It generally is not the case. So going back, first thing is when you're in a situation where there's a mental health crisis, particularly maybe if there's concern that someone may be suicidal, the first thing I guess I would want you to think about is keeping track of what's being said. So it's one of those things that if you end up getting me involved, I'm going to ask you exactly what did the other person say? What information do you have? And the more specific you can be, the better assessment I can do and the better outcome we're going to have. And so for oftentimes when you guys are going to get involved around a mental health incident, not maybe responding with DPS, is somebody's going to have said something to a third party who's then going to report that, and you're going to respond for an emotionally disturbed person. The language that you get, so exactly what that person says, has a lot of import on what the ultimate outcome is. So person A, I don't know, Sam, says, I'm going to kill myself, I'm leaving here and I'm going to do whatever, goodbye, screw you, whatever, to whatever friend, and that's what gets reported to you. You call me, I'm going to say, Sam's going to the hospital. He's going to CPAP and that's where he's going to CPAP. That language is important because that directed threat, particularly if needs and that sort of thing are involved, I want to make sure Sam has time to kind of cool down, that there's a very thorough assessment, particularly if this is in the middle of the night. I don't want to assess Sam over the phone and then kind of let him go and then kind of, what's he going to do? So particularly the kind of situation, it's going to be a trip to CPAP. Most things are not that direct. Most times you get called in and maybe the person's like, well, I've been really sad, I've been depressed, I have a lot of doubts about suicide. That's going to be those cases where I'm really going to want to talk to somebody to figure out what's going on, how long they've been depressed, what kind of thoughts are they having, have they thought about means, how often do they think about means, have they ever attempted before, what's their intent, how have they kind of distracted themselves from this, how long do the thoughts last, how distressing the event, how are they functioning, are they going to class, are they not, do they have other supports, are they able to generally manage when these kinds of things come up? I mean, there's a whole host of questions that really doing an assessment on the phone with somebody, it'd be a bare minimum of 30 minutes and I'm asking a ton of stuff, probably up to an hour on the phone that I would do to actually assess what's going on, come up with a plan, make sure the person is comfortable using the plan to keep themselves safe. And if I didn't feel comfortable, if they said, yes, I keep myself safe, and there's something about what they've said that makes me feel comfortable, again, the call's not going to end without them going to the hospital. So I'll get back to your question, I'm weaving around. What are the right things to say? The right things to say depend on what you know. So what do you know coming up on the scene and what's your relationship with the person? What do you do when you show up with somebody with a medical condition? So somebody having some sort of fainting spell, how do you approach that person?
Well, the first thing that we assess is level of consciousness to see if they're alert or anxious. And then we go on to assessing the airway, breathing, and circulation. In terms of questioning, it's mainly directed towards what exactly happened, what has been the situation recently, and trying to get a sense of what is really bothering this person.
And so it's saying, and that way, it's actually the beginning is going to be really kind of the same. That in some sense, if I'm starting with somebody on the phone and I'm concerned, I'm getting a report that somebody thinking about suicide or depressed, only my first question to the person is going to be something like, so what's going on? Tell me what happened. Why are they calling you? What do you need? And depending on what they say, then my follow-up questions are really going to kind of track them. And there are certain things I'm going to want to ask, but I'm going to generally want to keep the person somewhat in charge, unless they're all over the place, and then I'm going to become much more structured. And so really, before I start asking, say, questions about suicide, I really want, they say, it's been really rough, I cut my friends, they don't understand anything. I really want to build rapport. And so it's about relationship building. It's like, so part of that means, one, nonverbals, how attentive am I to the person, nodding, that sort of thing, just showing that I'm listening. And I'm going to reflect back what I hear. So whether that's reflecting this particular, so this has been a rough week, or reflecting what emotions are, so you're really upset, you're really scared. Almost in some sense of both showing them I'm listening, but also kind of asking, am I getting it right? Am I hearing what you're saying? And gradually, part of why I'm doing that is I want them to keep talking. And the more I can kind of show them I'm listening and kind of understanding what's going on, I want the person to tell me how bad it is. And generally, I need them to feel comfortable. And so I reflect part of that back, and then it gets to the place of, if they say they're depressed, not that I expect you guys to go through all the stuff, but for me, I would go through all the depressive symptoms for your sense of how depressed are they, how much are they not functioning. And if I get enough of that, and they tell me about, relationship breakup, all these kinds of negative life events, so maybe I'm failing out in school, recent relationship breakup, conflict with family, lost all my friends, all these kinds of negative events, and I'm like, this is concerning. The more of those I have, the more concerned I am about how the person's doing. Are they under the influence of substances? How much, how badly? All kinds of, one of the things, most people who die by suicide have alcohol on board, like well above 80%, and I don't know the number particularly for students, but for adults, in general, it's like 80, low 80s percentage of people who die by suicide have alcohol on board. Alcohol makes people more impulsive, lowers the threshold for people to act out against themselves. So when someone's drinking, it's one of those things, if you end up talking with us and someone has alcohol on board, you'll find that we tend to be not wanting to do an assessment if somebody's intoxicated. We're going to lean towards taking them to the hospital rather than doing an assessment over the phone. Because with alcohol on board, unless it's like a drink, generally it's hard to do a good assessment. So I'm going to listen for all these background events. The other thing I'm going to listen for are potential warning signs of suicide. So things that, again, gatekeeper training that we talk to people to listen for as sort of warning signs for suicide. One is obviously any kind of clear indication of ideation. So I'm having thoughts about suicide, or they make a threat, or somebody's collecting this huge stash of pain medication for some reason. What's that about? Unless they have the world's worst headache constantly. Generally, there's some things that you're writing about death or dying, talking about death or dying frequently, and you're not in a course about Sylvia Plath or Emily Dickinson. It's, right, what's this about? It's concerning. Changes in substance use. So someone's all of a sudden using substance a lot more. So you get they've been drinking a lot recently. They've been smoking a lot recently. Those changes are meaningful. Someone reflects what we call purposelessness. So there's no point in life. Why bother? This has no meaning. I don't even care anymore. That's concerning. Anxiety. So the more anxious somebody is, that's a potential warning sign. Particularly if they're more agitated, unable to sleep. Long periods of time with not being able to sleep, we all tend to get, one, less able to manage emotions, and two, we become more impulsive. A person reflecting feeling trapped, they feel stuck in a situation, there's no way to solve this. Hopelessness, things aren't getting better, this is always going to be awful, I'm never going to feel any different, I'm always going to be depressed. The number one predictor of a suicide attempt is a previous suicide attempt. The number two predictor of a suicide attempt is hopelessness. Withdrawal, so somebody who's been really connected with other people and all of a sudden is spending a lot of time alone, isolating, that's a warning sign. Anger, revenge seeking, rage, all those things, warning sign. Reckless behavior, so someone who's doing really, really risky things, endangering their safety. You know, it's almost like I don't care about my life, I'm just gonna do whatever, if I die, whatever. That's concerning. And then the significant mood changes. So someone's been really, really down and depressed, it's a really significant change. All those things are potential warning signs. Now, ideation is at a level all unto itself, because if they're saying I'm having thoughts about suicide, you already know they're having it. All the other ones suggest they might be. And the more of those you have, the more it's starting to like, maybe there's something going on. So if somebody reflects they're depressed, they have all these negative events, and they have a couple other warning signs, my guess is what you start to think is, I wonder if this person's having thoughts about suicide. If you have that thought pop in your head, like I wonder if this person's having thoughts about suicide, you then have to ask the question. You can't say, well, you know, I'm not going to ask, I'm not going to make them uncomfortable. The thought pops in, you ask the question. How do you ask the question?
You say, you're not feeling suicidal, right? Because that would make me uncomfortable.
Right. It really is one of those things that's really hard to ask the question. And so there's ways that asking the question, you can really tell the person, I want to know. So you're not having thoughts about suicide, are you? I'll shake my head. I'm telling you what the right answer is. Don't say yes. Then I'm going to go with paperwork. Things will get difficult. So really, if you're going to ask the question, your expectation should be getting a yes back, and be prepared and be comfortable that they're going to say yes. And if they say no, that's okay too. But if you get to the place where you're asking the question, you should be comfortable getting a yes. Does that make sense? As far as how to ask the question, it's best to be as direct as possible. One of the other ways that we tend to ask the question, because we don't want to make anybody uncomfortable, is, so thoughts about hurting yourself? What does that mean? What thoughts about hurting yourself? Maybe I cut a little bit, maybe I drink too much and I know that's not good for me. I'm going to call my ex, but I know it's not a healthy relationship. It means a whole lot of different things to different people. And so if I want to know if somebody's having thoughts about suicide, you really need to ask, are you having thoughts about suicide? So the point of asking that question directly is, one, when they answer, I know one way or the other what the answer is. The other part is, if I'm able to ask the question and be comfortable asking it directly, I'm actually conveying to the other person, I get how bad things are. That being able to ask that is like, I understand you're so depressed that this is a reasonable outcome, that you're having these thoughts. Yeah.
Where's the point where just wondering if you should pry more? If you say, are you having thoughts about suicide? They say no, and you're still questionable. Should you keep asking them these questions, or when do you kind of back off, even if you're really suspicious or you really think that's important?
Nope, that's a good question, because what I will say is, depending on the situation, someone may be having thoughts about suicide and they may say no, particularly if somebody else has said the person has made statements that they're going to kill themselves, and you ask them and they say no. The total misunderstanding. Honestly, I don't believe that.
Yeah.
Somebody else telling me somebody made a suicidal statement, people just don't call and make that up. I mean, it's incredibly rare. So, and the person generally is wanting not to get in trouble, not have anything kind of happen to this and just kind of sweep it under the rug. And so if somebody else has already said they've made suicidal statements, particularly I'm going to kill myself, it's important for you to ask all that, but if they made that statement, hopefully DPS is also involved with you, I still want to call. I still want to assess, because I don't believe it. And really what I want is, oftentimes this is going to take place over social media, so text message, Facebook, Twitter, something like that. Generally there are electronic records of this. And the nice thing is, if I can get those and the person tells me, no, I didn't say anything, it's like, well, actually right here, you said this, so help me understand what happened. And the goal is not for me to be a detective or kind of be an ass about it. But when somebody makes those statements, somebody's not doing well when they say that. And even if they say, well, no, I didn't really mean it. If you get to the place where you're making those statements, you're not doing well. And it's generally the dealing with depression, they're dealing with isolation. There's a lot of other things going on, and I'm gonna get them help, but the person denying it, we can't get to the place where we start working on it. Does that make sense? So if you're not believing it, I would say it's still okay to get us involved. You don't have to, if there's lots of other kind of risk factors and it seems like, oh, this person's not doing well, there's lots of red flags, just because they say no doesn't mean you have to not say, okay, it's all clear, let's move on. One of the other things sometimes is that sometimes a no is clearly a yes. So if you ask someone, so are you having thoughts about suicide? And the response is, pause. Really? Pause means yes. The other thing is, well, not really. Not really is yes. Not really, because oftentimes when someone says no or not really, it's like, well, I don't really plan to act on it. That's not my question. It's, are you having thoughts about it? Because really, and again, it's just because somebody's having thoughts doesn't mean they're going to have to go to the hospital, and very few people do. But I need to know if they're having it so I can get a baseline and know how serious they are. And so no matter if it's like the vagus thought that happens, once every couple of weeks and happens, I want to be able to assess what that is. I don't want the person taking the ability to assess it out of my hands. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I have a two-part question. The first would be, once a student already is taken to the hospital, and they say they go to CPAP and they're released from CPAP, are you guys then involved in their further care? And who initiates that branch? Because in a few of my situations, I've had patients who have gone to CPAP, been discharged. A day later, I'm taking them back to CPAP for the same exact thing that they were just in.
Yeah. And honestly, what I'd say is it kind of depends on how they get there. So if the person's going voluntarily, and so they're like, DPS isn't notified, they haven't made a threat, and so maybe they're having some difficulty, your friend gets them to agree to go. Oftentimes, we're not going to find out about that because CPAP will only notify us if they're referring them back to us, and sometimes they don't call us and say, hey, so-and-so is getting out of the hospital. They may send us a fax saying, we're referring so-and-so back to you, so if you want the records, give us a call. Unless it's something really more serious, in which they'll do more case management. If it's something like where either we're involved, the person's made a threat and they go to the hospital and DPS knows, generally there's a university procedure in place where the person's going to have to come back through us, like what we call a mandated contact. Essentially, once a person's released from the hospital, at some point in a relatively short time frame, they need to come and meet with us, do an assessment, so we can kind of figure out what's going on and figure out what sort of resources need to be in place. Sometimes CPAP has done that with them, sometimes they don't, and the person's kind of in and out like a turnstile. Depending on sort of what the issue, so somebody who is psychotic, so having some reality testing, not doing that well, but not really bad, sometimes they can have multiple they need to go there, they get to CPAP, they're sort of stabilized, they're not bad enough to kind of keep there long term, CPAP lets them out, they have a couple of stressors, it gets worse again, they're not on meds, they're not stabilizing, and there can be multiple iterations. Part of the complication can be someone can be psychotic and they are free to roam about. Not everybody who's psychotic can be forcibly hospitalized. It's actually a fairly small percentage. If the person's a danger to themselves or others, we can get them there. If somebody is really not doing well, obviously we can meet with them and try to convince them they need to go. But there's a line, and sometimes it's kind of like I'm looking and I'm like, I really want the person to go. I try to talk them into going, and they don't want to, and I'm just kind of like, I have my hands tied, and I know that if it's bad enough and the person's not taking meds, it's just a matter of time. I'm just kind of waiting for them to kind of get bad enough where they're going to be taken there forcibly. That's not a good situation. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen that often, but sometimes it does. Yeah.
What if the person already attempted suicide and that's why we're called to the scene? Do you treat them, in our lucid, do you treat them the same way, or?
It's slightly different.
Okay.
So in the case of somebody having attempted, what'll happen is they'll go to the hospital, and so first they'll be medically cleared in the ER, and then, depending if it's an overdose, maybe Tylenol, they might go someplace much more like intensive care, something like that can be held temporarily. And then, depending on the hospital, they're gonna either have psychiatry come down and evaluate them, or they may switch, for upstate, they may have psychiatry come in hospital, or they may ultimately switch them over to St. Joe's CPEP for an evaluation there to determine whether they need to go inpatient. If somebody makes an attempt, and generally if you guys are there, DPS knows, and we find out about it, there's a different process, such that when the person is released from the hospital, they are not allowed back on campus, they are not allowed back in class until they've completed an evaluation process with us. And really, we get hospital records, we talk to new therapists, and really the goal of that is to figure out, is the person able to be back on campus and function as a student at that time, particularly if somebody's been in the hospital for 2 weeks, and there were a lot of stressors going before then, maybe they weren't going to classes, maybe the attempt was a pretty lethal attempt, and there's no way to mitigate their risk in coming back. The way the thing's set up is they sign a bunch of releases, we make recommendations, and the Dean of Student Affairs decides whether the person comes back. The vast majority of people who make attempts actually come back in pretty quick order. But generally those people get in and out of the hospital pretty quick. It's generally not a lethal attempt, it's generally impulsive, they generally have a lot of protective factors, and so the vast majority come back, really not a problem, they still have to go through our process. In some cases it really is, the person really meant to die, they wake up in the attempt, they're sad that they're still alive, the risk sort of stays, they're in the hospital for a long time. It really is not in anyone's best interest for the student to come back. And in that case, we make recommendations to the Dean of Student Affairs, they kind of make a decision, there's an appeals process. Generally what happens in those cases is the person's family gets involved, and we talk with them about what all the risks are, and it really is in the person's best interest to take a medical leave, and that's how most of those cases actually end. But it's not a forcible, but trying to get them to do what's needed.
What can we do, like, during the call as EMTs or like crew members to like ease that person, like on the way to the hospital? Like, are there certain like bedside manners we should have? Like talking to them, guys?
I just say this, be supportive. Just obviously not judging, like, why the hell did you do that? Again, I don't think you're going to do some of that. It's for the person who attempts, they're in a really dark place, and for them, in that moment, in that impulsive second, this is the only way I can see how to manage this. That's what depression, if someone stays there long enough, that's how they see the world. I'd say that's most people who attempt do it impulsively, and then immediately after, like, what the hell did I do? And then you may call themselves for emergency medical attention. Part of it is just sort of check to see how they're doing. At that point, I guess I would say just do sort of, other than being supportive, I say there's nothing really you have to do.
And not always, actually, at least in my experience, the people who actually attempt are not awake to talk to you. They're not usually in a conscious state, from my experience on campus with that. Something I just want to say too, before I forget, it's really important for you guys to talk to your trainers in the suits about how you're feeling with the call. And it doesn't matter if the person is successful or if they're just talking about something. If it hits home with you or makes you feel uncomfortable and you want to talk about it, A, afterwards, if your trainer doesn't sit you down automatically, or B, if you want to go home, please voice that, because there was a call last year where myself included, we all went home because it was tough and it's hard to deal with, and it doesn't matter if you've had personal experience, know somebody, or it's just a difficult call. That's okay. If you need to go home afterwards, or you want to talk to someone, or you want to call the counseling center, just make sure that you're, letting us know what's going on and how you're feeling.
And that's okay. I was on that call with Ariel, and I said, oh no, like, I'm strong, I'm fine, like, this didn't bother me. And it bothered me a lot more than I thought, and it just took me a little while to realize it. So don't go, well, like, whatever, I'm too strong for that. Like, it's okay to be honest about it, and nobody's gonna judge you for that.
And stuff like that, Paul gets notified automatically, and he usually notifies Dr. Sexus, and he's also usually pretty good at getting us information, back to the crew that responded to the call. Letting us know how things went and that things got better. So if we knew like when their family arrived and that they were awake and that they were doing better. So just make sure you check in.
Well,
This is a question like probably on the soup side and maybe even on that side in these kind of emergencies, but there's been numerous times where my patient has felt threatened by DPS on scene. What can we do? Like what's the best, I guess, vantage point for us to approach the patient? Where can when is it appropriate to ask DPS, can you stand behind me? Can you support me in this? And instead of standing behind the patient, because I've had it numerous times where they've been standing behind the patient and that's scared my patient because, they're obviously very vulnerable. So when is it appropriate and what can we do to maintain that relationship? But also, is that the best way to approach it is have them stand with us on our side? I think that it's very confusing because I've asked and it's been perceived incorrectly, and created a tick. So, obviously we want to avoid that.
I have to say, be careful how you ask. I have had several calls where a DPS was making patients uncomfortable. I said, hey, would you mind just taking a step over here? And I've never had an issue with it. They will, most of the time they've been happy again. But just be careful how you ask and just tell them, I guess.
Like a lot of times if you state you need to do something for the patient instead of asking, saying, I need you to do this, it comes off better. Can I just talk to the patient alone for a couple of minutes? I promise I won't leave until I get you the information that you need. At the end of the day, we're there for the patient, we're there for to make sure that they are medically okay. And if we can't do that, then that's not all right. And they may, regardless of how you ask, they may be upset, but as long as you are doing your job and like we always say, you do something because you think that you are doing it for the right reason and you just have a reason to back that up, we'll back you and if it, if there's a complaint or whatever, all that's important is that the patient is okay. And if that means that they don't talk to DPS and DPS needs to go to the hospital and talk to them later, then that needs to be done.
And I will say, it's one of those things, I don't envy DPS their job and what they have to do, and some of the situations are tricky. I'm really glad they're there, and officers kind of vary on how good they are, how much they make people feel comfortable. It's complicated, particularly when you're being called there because someone's made an attempt, and it's like you're getting called by a third party, and there's something like that. It's I really appreciate that they are there. It's when you're asking for that space, be aware of who you're asking, who the patient is. Some people are going to get pretty squirrely without DPS to be pretty controlling. So I'd be aware of who that person is. Any question?
Oh, yeah. This is kind of for the sexual assault cases too. So just picturing myself going up on a traumatic situation like that where the person's clearly in hysterics. Initially I would think to kind of console them being it's going to be okay. But when you think about that, does that come off you're minimizing theirs? Because in their head they're this is the end of the world. So is that something you should avoid?
Right, that's a really good question. What did I say? It's one of those things, if we were doing a longer thing about sort of all the relationship building skills, one of what's generally best initially in a crisis situation, and again, it varies, and there's gender differences and other sort of cultural things, some people automatically skip to problem solving, whatever, is that most people when they have questions asked, and there's more paraphrasing support, relationship building stuff. So you're how they're feeling, you ask questions, and you're supportive. That generally from there you can go to helping them figure out what they want to do, get connected to resources, maybe transport them. That doing some of the things it's going to be fine. For some people it's reassuring. For some people it can be perceived as minimizing. And so part of it's sometimes it may not be. At least in the way you think. And so to say something slightly different, maybe I'm here, I'm going to help you in any way that I can.
Okay, that's because I'm just the first one to say it's going to be fine, but in their head, no, it's not. You know what I mean? So,
yeah, and absolutely. And again, we see somebody hurting, we want to kind of make it better. It's a natural human instinct of it's going to be fine, you're okay. Some of that's about trying to make the other person better, and honestly, some of it's about making us feel better. This can be fine.
Right.
Everybody be calm. This situation's manageable. Yeah.
I think I can add a little bit to this. Something we're taught in the EMT class is you very rarely want to say it's going to be okay because you don't know that. Something I would say to patients that are very unstable is I got it, like, I got you, like, I'm gonna take good care of you. I find that instills a lot more confidence in their state than saying it's gonna be okay. And I never really say, I know how it feels, or I know where you're coming from. Because, one, I don't. I'll be lying to them at that point. And two, they probably wouldn't.
Regardless if it's a psych or medical or trauma, just say like, no, you're in good hands, we're gonna figure it out. Because, you know, you're not trying to say you have all the answers, you're not trying to minimize the feelings, you're not saying that you know what's gonna happen, but you're saying that you're here and you're listening and that you're gonna be with them to the next step, you know, and you're gonna figure it out. People, like, I do with bystanders also, like, oh, dude, are they okay? No, we don't know, but they're okay for now, and we're gonna go figure out what's going on when we take them to the hospital.
And part of being with them is being comfortable with silence. You could try to ask them like a couple questions. If they don't respond, maybe it's not appropriate to approach them at this time. And that's kind of what Mitch was saying, is it's a fine line between you're asking questions like because you want to build a conversation, but you also want an actual person. When you are talking to someone and they're reciprocating the conversation, I just want to summarize some things that Mitch said. It's very important to be listening actively and kind of collecting the things that they're saying so that they can also hear like what they're saying, because sometimes they don't even know what the student said, what they are saying. And it's just important to just be with them.
That honestly is the most important piece, to be there and fully be there. And generally, one place we tend to get in trouble is suicide for a lot of reasons. It's a very anxiety-provoking topic for any of us, regardless. And then it's one of those things you take into account that for college students, it's estimated nationally that about 10% of college students endorse the statement, I have seriously considered suicide in the last year. So 1 out of 10. And then a lot of people may have had family members, friends who may have attempted or thought about. So you think about sort of in this room, it's likely that a significant number of people have been impacted by suicide in some way. So it's a generally anxiety-provoking topic. Take into account nature of additional personal connections makes it more anxiety-provoking. So the part of it is, like, when you're dealing with it, you're probably going to be anxious. That's just the way of it. And when I say, I don't want to say, well, you shouldn't be. It's like, when my phone goes off at 3 in the morning, I'm not like, oh, I'm really calm. It's like, what's going on? And it's okay to be anxious, but recognizing you're anxious, and it's okay, and focusing your energy on what's going on in the situation, not going into worst case scenario, not trying to make it about what's going on with me, what's going on with the person, and being okay being anxious. It's fine to be anxious in a situation. I'd say it's more problematic if you're not. For me, what I sort of say is the biggest take-home out of all this is when someone has mentioned suicide, regardless of whether at the end of it they say, oh no, you know, I never do anything, oh, I'm fine, but you know the person's had thoughts, I really want me to be called, or the person in the hospital, like, if you're finding out someone's thinking about suicide, I would encourage you not to have it end and just kind of like let the person go on their merry way without having them be assessed by a mental health person. Yeah, oftentimes it's very complicated. And having done some assessments over the phone where an assessment over the phone where the person later, like at the end of said assessment, fled and had to be taken to the hospital ultimately, it's like, it can get messy occasionally. And so at the end of the day, I'd like for it to be me or someone like me who's ultimately holding the end of it, so you don't feel like you're stuck, like, I did an evaluation and now I'm responsible. I don't think that's fair to you.
And from our end, that doesn't necessarily mean calling a counseling center. That just means that this person that we're doing everything that we can so that this person's problems are being addressed, whether that's taking them to the hospital or leaving them with DPS to follow up if they're open to it.
Can I just get clarification? Like, when you're being called to do an assessment, are you assessing the validity of a threat, or?
If the person's made a direct threat, like I'm going to kill myself, and it's somebody, we're generally going to send them to the hospital.
Right.
The reason, one, is because it's serious, and particularly if it's the middle of the night. there's about time to cool off, time to get multiple eyes on them. Part of it, honestly, is that buys me time. Because for me to really be able to do a good assessment, I need the collateral data. What does the text say? And those, the person they called, what language did they use? And without all that information, I can't really do a good assessment. Because then I'm going to ask the person, so did you say something? No. Well, the person said that you said this. No, I didn't say that. They misunderstood. Well, no, I've never had doubts. No, I've never been depressed. And they'll deny everything. And on some level, I can't do anything about it. I can't help somebody who won't give me anything. Versus if I have the collateral data, there's something to work with.
Right. It gets sticky for us in the New York State mental health law, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but if a person's a threat to themselves or others, they have to go.
Yep. And that's always fine. Yeah, and if that person's to the hospital, that's absolutely fine. You don't have to involve us. And people that made a threat, I want them to go to the hospital. So I guess there's 941 and 942. 941 is the safety officer themselves, I think, and 942 is the mental health person getting the public safety officer transport. And we do that. We even do that from our office sometimes. If the person's in that place where they made a threat and are a danger to themselves, they need to the hospital to be stabilized. I absolutely agree. And I don't want to sort of put myself in between that process happening. Yeah.
So I think we've spoken a lot today about when we are the first to contact the patients, but as a former RA, I know that RA protocol is not to call SUA for suicidal ideation as a resident, but instead to call DPS and you. At what point do you make the call that this person needs to go to the hospital and it's not just a DPS transport, but you want SUA called?
I'd say, honestly, it's rare. It generally means they've done something. I think the only time, I'm pretty up on counseling center stuff, but we've called SUA from the counseling center because somebody has taken an overdose of stuff. Sometimes like a day or two earlier, but it's a pretty substantial amount of stuff. At that point, they need to go in the ER and be evaluated. It's now a medical thing. So if it's clearly a medical thing, we're going to call you. I've gotten called by somebody who actually made a suicide attempt by an overdose and then called the counseling center, kind of panicked. At that point, I have the person on my ear, and meanwhile I'm calling DPS to get to you guys. And there's a particular reason why I'm calling DPS, because I don't want it just handled as a medical situation. I want it handled as a university because it's going to get a whole messy with res life and this person in a good place. And so I do it through the DPS route to let us kind of control the situation a little better, knowing that you're still going to respond and the person got transferred to the hospital. But and all my time that I've been here, it's like, there's not a lot of times where we're going to be calling you, because generally if it's where you need to be called, you guys know before we do, and we're getting kind of notified on the back end, because generally it's not text.
So we typically have some times where we've been contacted to use our medical transport service to bring these people to the hospital to see that. When do you choose that service over DPS?
We used to use medical transport a lot, and we go along with people. If the person is to go to the hospital now, we use DPS. We're not going to use medical transport. Just because sometimes a person going voluntarily changes very quickly, and this just holds like voluntary, involuntary versus willing. Sometimes the person's willing to go, so they're voluntary sort of, but they told me enough that they are going involuntary, so they're willingly going. But my thing to CPAP is, this is a 942. This person has to be here because they are a danger to themselves or others. There's too many of those times where people change their mind. It's like, I don't want med transport to be stuck in a situation where things go messy.
And times where medical transport taking that person to the counseling center is because basically my EMS manager wanted me to mention that if you guys are calling us, because we did have an incident recently, that our dispatchers should know that we need to be told over the phone that this is the situation, this person does not have injuries, I only want a medical transport van.
I think that might have been directly related to sexual assault. I think otherwise we would explain a little bit.
Yep.
I think we've had some confusion with both, which is why I wanted to bring it up.
Well, and really, this is a situation where we're asking for transport. There's ways in which, I think sometimes we're a little rigid about confidentiality, not wanting to share too much, but we really need to be able to convey enough that you guys sort of understand what level. And so I guess what I'd say is if you're not getting enough information to tell us, and then sometimes maybe that person might need to talk to somebody else to know, like, yeah, you need to share this. It's not because we're trying to be a pain in the butt. I think sometimes we get so rigid trying to make sure the person's rights are respected, but I think sometimes we don't honestly think very rationally. We're human too.
Oh, yeah, no, I was just trying to clarify that for all of us, that way we know in the future.
All right. Thank you guys very much.